Yesterday was the final of the January 6th committee, because, as you know, the Republicans will be taking control of the House, and they're not so interested in that, in what happened on January 6th and what led up to it. Here is Committee Chair Bennie Thompson essentially setting off a montage of some of their major revelations over the past several months. Here's that.
It's important to remember what we've learned, and critically, exactly what happened at the United States Capitol on January 6th. Without objection, I include in the record a video presentation of some of the key evidence our investigation has uncovered.
There were officers on the ground. They were bleeding. They were throwing up. I mean, I saw friends with blood all over their faces. I was slipping in people's blood.
As I was swarmed by a violent mob, they ripped off my badge. They grabbed and stripped me of my radio. They seized ammunition that was secured to my body. They began to beat me with their fists and with what felt like hard metal objects.
The key thing to do is to claim victory. No, we won. Fuck you. Sorry, over. We won. Yeah. You're wrong. Fuck you.
Right out of the box on election night, the president claimed that there was major fraud underway. I mean, this happened, as far as I could tell, before there was actually any potential of looking at evidence.
I didn't think what was happening was necessarily honest or professional at that point in time. So that led to me stepping away.
Generally discussed on that topic was whether the fraud, maladministration, abuse, or irregularities, if aggregated and read most favorably to the campaign, would that be outcome determinative? And I think everyone's assessment in the room, at least amongst the staff, Mark Short, myself, and Greg Jacob, was that it was not sufficient to be outcome determinative.
So, in other words, they all, no one around the president was, well, I shouldn't say that. The president was certainly aware, Trump at the time was aware that he'd lost. And, repeatedly, the plan was, we're just going to say that we didn't lose. And talk about manifesting.
Fake it till you make it.
Yeah.
And what's also really interesting about this, let's pop up this Beschloss tweet, because this has really been the point from the beginning. I don't think Donald Trump is going to go to jail, folks. There's every indication that the Department of Justice has been slow walking this the whole way through. I guess I can in some way understand it, because they're worried about, tackling something this politically sensitive.
But also powerful people not going to prison for their crimes is as American as apple pie. And real crooks like Trump, they let other guys like Manafort take the fall. They have goons on their staff that do this kind of stuff. And I just don't know if he'll actually face consequences.
He won't necessarily. But what's important is that there is a marker put down for the future. And Michael Beschloss, historian, had a tweet yesterday, and I should say hat tip to Duncan Black at Atrios, who pointed this out. I saw this on his blog. Beschloss wrote, today shows that a mistake was made in pardoning Nixon and sparing him prosecution and possibly jail. Had Nixon had to face more dire consequences than exile, it would have presented an important admonition to later presidents that they could not break the law without suffering. I think you can say this about Watergate. I think you can say this about Iran-Contra. Mm-hmm. I think you can say this about the Keating 7. I think you can say this about Bush 2 in terms of the Iraq War. Over and over again, it is good that Beschloss is making this point. because this is the point.
And Beschloss is like a very august sort of Sunday news
PBS,
show,
PBS
type of
style historian. Now, with that said, Beschloss, this is a fairly recent perspective that Beschloss is taking. In 2007, again, Duncan Black, Atrios pointed this out, 2007 at a JFK library function, the presidential library, he wrote, or he said, I guess, in a conversation with Al Hunt. This was he was like a pundity type of guy years ago. What about Gerald Ford? Gerald Ford pardoning Nixon, I think, was courageous and in retrospect wise. This is in 2007. And one of the things I think is actually quite lovely is that Gerald Ford said before he died that one of the things that emotionally meant the most to him was getting the Profile and Courage Award, because it made him feel that despite the fact that he had gone through all that flack and people denouncing him saying, did you make a secret deal with Nixon to get the presidency in exchange for a pardon? He felt that in the end he had been vindicated. Well, and one thing that's sort of pointed about history is that oftentimes people are not with honor in their time. And the nice thing being with Ford is that he lived to see it. And Alan and I think you were not on the committee, but we were not there then. So, I mean, it really, putting aside what it says about Beschloss, who, one of those things about history, I guess, that the longer that we have, the more that we can reinterpret history. This isn't quite one of those situations. This is just, but whether the light has shone on Michael Beschloss sooner or later rather than sooner is almost secondary. The point being that at one point this guy realizes that any holding to account of people in power is important, whether they get punished for it or not. Always better if they get more punished for it, without a doubt. But whether they get punished for it or not is important because it sets down a marker for the behavior that we as a society are willing to accept in the future.
When was that quote? 2007?
Yeah.
That almost aligns perfectly with Nancy Pelosi's cowardice on not going after the Bush administration for their war crimes, and then the shift that you see now, even though, of course, we'd want more of it, but within the Democratic Party, where they actually are attempting to do something, at least with what we saw with Trump.
I don't even think it was a coincidence, too, that Beschloss had said something like that in 2007, because they were anticipating the possibility
turn the page
of an impeachment hearings that would take place once the Democrats took control of both the Senate and the House and the presidency. In 2008. I don't know exactly when that was there, but that was definitely in the air. And yes, the danger with Donald Trump is as much about the fact that it's only about Donald Trump.
Yes. That
he becomes this sui generis figure in our political history where George Bush can get whitewashed and his history revised and his turd, as it were, polished, and he can look good in relation to Donald Trump. Just a recollection, as odious as Donald Trump was and is, George Bush was responsible for killing anywhere from 200,000 to 1 million people. You can get with the most conservative, you can go with the U.S. Defense Department numbers, or you can go with, the way that most organizations counted these things. But regardless, hundreds of thousands of people dead because George Bush is, as a function of George Bush lying to this country. And I will say one more thing, too. I think I was on the boat when Marjorie Taylor Greene made her joke about Steve Bannon, if she and Steve Bannon went in and did January 6th, they would have won. And she came back and said it was a sarcastic joke and people were really offended. George Bush in 2003 or 4, I think it was 2004, got up in front of the correspondence dinner and made an extended joke about where are the weapons of mass destruction. Hundreds of thousands of people died because innocent civilians died because he went after that. And I brought that up on the boat on a panel, and there was someone on the panel, I think it was Cecile Richards, who was there that night. And she said it also had followed someone who had talked about losing a loved one in the war.
He's a monster.
And the media did not hold George Bush to account. And certainly, the Besh losses and whatnot did not hold George Bush to account for that. So,
and that's why we cannot treat Trump as an aberration. He has to be treated as an accumulation, because just to bring it back to the Nixon point here, like that, the cowardice of Gerald Ford was called courage by a lot of people. And now that we've stepped away from it, you can see that set the precedent for the moment that we're living in right now. It created presidents like Bush and Trump, and it also allowed them to get away with the stuff that they got away with. And Trump will get away with this.
Left is deft. You can also say the same thing about prosecuting Robert E. Lee and the other Confederate traitors. The precedent to look the other way at treason committed by powerful white men in this country is a long story. I couldn't agree more. In fact, talk about it's not the original sin but it was
not occupying the South for a generation.
It was the last biggest original sin, because we got a do-over. It's not that often in life or in institutions that you get a total do-over, but Reconstruction could have been. And in many respects, that's probably why they knew they had to assassinate Lincoln. Mm-hmm. But we would be living in a very, very, very different America today had the radical Republicans been able to push through their agenda, and had they been just slightly more aggressive in making the defeated Confederacy act and deal with being defeated. So,
in Hinge Points, Matt Christman talks about the possibility that instead of choosing Johnson as Vice President, Lincoln would have chosen Spoons Butler, who was the general who originally used basically freed slaves, what they called contrabands back then in the war fighting thing. And he was like a brutal anti-slavery guy. That would have been, we would have needed to occupy the South and force that Reconstruction, because there was still a lot of white supremacy down there. And we decided to instead just finish conquering the West of Native Americans.